Raven's Flight by Diane Silvey. Chapter 1. Raven shuffled the letters on the kitchen table like a deck of cards, hungry for any scrap of news from her sister Marcy. Marcy had left Egmont to look for a job in Vancouver several weeks ago and had sent only cryptic messages assuring her parents she was surviving since. She had not shared any specific details about her job or how she was making ends meet. After several unsatisfactory phone calls, the family began to suspect she was keeping something from them. Marcy had made her decision to move to the city, rooming with her 19-year-old cousin Rita, as a way to escape the small community on BC's Sunshine Coast. But her perception of the city had been built on a flimsy foundation of rumor, gossip, and dream. Marcy had been sure she would find work that would finance a new life, her own car, apartment, wardrobe, plenty of spending money, and maybe even a boyfriend. But it was a sunny Sunday morning, so Raven brushed aside her worry in favor of the distraction of work. She stuffed her gloves, tire wire, and machete, checking to make sure it was locked in its case, in her knapsack, and set off across the fields to the woods. The overgrown and weedy path soon became too difficult to navigate. She unsheathed the machete and grasped it by its hilt. She swung it in wide, sweeping arcs so the tall grass met the sharp blade with a swish, and quickly cleared up a trail up the hill. At the peak of the hill lay a campground, but the discovery of tainted drinking water in its well last season meant it was now virtually deserted. Raven entered the campground from the north end and resumed hiking toward the salal berry patch. Her family had picked salal in this spot for as long as she could remember. She and her favorite Aunt Edna had passed hours here on the weekends, their nimble fingers plucking handfuls of the salal bush for sale to a wholesaler, who in turn had sold it to the florist in town, its dark green leaves providing a flourish in bouquets and centerpieces. After several hours of picking, Raven gathered all the salal bush she could carry, bound it in bundles, and hoisted it on her back. She adjusted her grandmother's hand-woven tumpline across her shoulders and took the south trail home along the old logging road. Rounding a huge stump, she came upon a large black truck with oversized wheels, parked on the side of the trail. Small, sack-like pouches were spread out on the ground behind the tailgate. The remains of a female bear lay slit open on the ground next to them. The scene resembled a grotesque sacrificial offering. Raven knew the high demand for bear gallbladders made poaching a very lucrative business. One alone could fetch over $2,000. Unscrupulous hunters illegally sold the fist-sized sacks to smugglers, who transported them to the black market in Hong Kong, where they were worth their weight in gold for use in traditional Chinese medicinal remedies. The slaughter was perpetuated by the hunter's greed and by the buyer's ignorance and superstition. Raven's grandmother had raised her to appreciate their own traditional ways, to respect not only the bear, but all living things. She'd been taught that if an animal was to be killed, the hunter must first prepare ritually, then explain to the animal why it was needed. Her grandmother had warned her that no one should ever waste any part of an animal, as this would both be careless and disrespectful. If these practices were not followed, the animal would not offer itself to the hunter. She heard male voices nearby, and assuming they were the hunters, Raven dropped her bundle of salal in her haste to avoid being seen. The noise alerted them to her presence, and they immediately gave chase. She raced toward the beach trail, sure they were following and gaining ground. Raven heard heavy breathing and the thud of footsteps several feet behind her. "Leave her. She won't be able to identify us or the truck, and we have to deliver this load tonight." Raven heard one of the men yell from further off in the distance. She tucked behind a tree and watched as the other man angrily stomped up the path. He flung the trunk door open so hard it nearly ripped off the hinges. He jumped into the front seat, cursing, and punched the dashboard with such force his clenched fist left an indentation. Meanwhile, his partner had gathered the pouches and stored them in the back of the truck. In a hurry to meet his buyer, he pumped the accelerator and the truck roared off, dirt spewing from a fan behind its spinning tires. Raven breathed a sigh of relief and headed home. When she got back to the house, her dad called from the other room. "Raven, is that you?" Raven replied with a rush of words, anxious to explain the whole story behind the poachers. When she asked her father to call the conservation officer and report the illegal activity in the woods. "We'll do that in a minute, but right now we have a more pressing matter to deal with. Marcy is missing," her father said. "Missing? What happened?" Raven said, alarmed. We don't know. Your cousin Rita phoned the store and left a message saying no one had seen or heard from your sister in days, he said worriedly. Someone has to go to the city and look for her, Raven blurted. There's barely enough food for you and your brothers, let alone enough to go to the city, he explained. I have money. We can use that, Raven answered. She had earned extra money picking salal or taking babysitting jobs on weekends while she went to high school. Half of the money she earned was set aside for university, and the rest she put into the family pot for groceries. Raven studied hard to keep up her grade point average in hopes of a university scholarship to UBC. If she completed the law program, she would be the first in her village to acquire a university degree. We can't use your money, he said, adamant that her savings be kept for tuition. We have no choice. I can always put off going for another year if I have to, Raven insisted. Which one of us will go? Your mother can't go. She can't leave the baby, her father said, his brow furrowed. And I can't go now or I'd lose my job at the fishery. I'll go, Raven offered. You can't go. You're too young to be in the city by yourself, he said, as fast as the words left her lips. I have to go. I'll be all right. I can look after myself. Besides, I can stay with Rita. She's an adult. If Marcy isn't there, there will be a spare bed. I'll have a place to stay, and I'll be in the area where she likely disappeared. It's my best chance of finding her. Rita will look out for me, Raven pleaded. I haven't seen Rita in a long time. I don't even know what she does or what the neighborhood is like. The area may not be safe. How do we know we could trust her to look after you? We don't have a choice. No one else can go. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something. I'm sure she wouldn't mind if I stayed with her, Raven coaxed. I could go over to the store and call her from there. If it's all right with Rita, you can go, but you have to listen to her. Vancouver is not a safe place. I don't even want you to go on the city bus alone. You have to be supervised. A few moments later, her father grabbed his coat and headed toward the beach. Raven and her two younger brothers, Alan and Tim, scampered after him, eager for a ride in the fishing boat. Her father held the boat steady as they jumped in, checked to make sure their life jackets were fastened properly, and headed toward the store on the far shore. 15 minutes later, he tied the boat on the dock's mooring post and walked toward Frank's general store. Raven's brothers' hoots and hollers were more than enough to announce the company was coming. As the bells above the door rang, Frank, the owner, came out to the counter. Hey, Jim, how you been keeping? Frank asked. I've been better, Frank, but hanging in there. You? Jim replied. The two boys already had their noses pressed against the candy display case. My arthritis is acting up, but other than that, I'm fine. Looks like these two youngsters have their hearts set on something. What'll it be, boys? Frank chuckled softly. He had been a friend of the family for years. Licorice sticks, they yelled in chorus. Frank passed them each a long stalk of black licorice. Why don't you sit outside the front steps with Raven? I won't be long, their father instructed. Frank, I need to call my niece in Vancouver. Sure, what's the number? He pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket and placed a long-distance call with the operator. The phone in the second-floor hallway of Rita's rooming house rang and rang, but finally someone answered and knocked on Rita's door to tell her she had a call. Rita got on the line, her voice weary and low. Rita, is that you? How are you? It's your Uncle Jim, Raven's father said. I'm fine. I guess you got my message this afternoon. Are you coming to town? Rita answered. Actually, I'm phoning to ask if Raven can come and stay with you for a few days. I have to work, but if she doesn't mind looking after herself until I get home, she hedged. I think she'll be all right if she stays close by and is only out by day. I can check in on her at this number. I'll put her on the bus tomorrow. When will she get into the depot? Rita asked unenthusiastically. The bus arrives at 10 p.m. tomorrow night. Not a great schedule, but it's the only one that works with the ferry. Rita wrote the instructions on a notepad. I'll meet her at the station. I could use the help with the rent now that Marcy's not around. The landlord collects weekly. She'll have some spending money and enough to cover the days she's there. Hopefully both my girls will be home soon. We're trying not to worry. Call us as soon as she gets there, okay? Don't worry, I'll take good care of her, Rita said, hanging up. She doodled over the instructions on the notepad. The message read, May 9th. But was that 10 or 11 p.m.? Raven was quiet on the boat trip back, suddenly worried she had spoken too soon, too confidently. Back at the house, She and her father reached under her bed and took the old safety deposit box. Raven walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, reaching in and pulled out a key. Opening the box, her father took out a stack of papers, photos of the family, and a tin can with Raven's name on it. It held $2,345, the sum of what she had saved. "How much do you think I'll need?" Raven asked. "It's hard to say. You won't need much for your accommodation, and hopefully Rita's got food in the apartment, so it'll just be transportation money and an emergency stash if something comes up. It's better not to take too much in case it gets stolen, lost, or tempts you to spend foolishly," he said. "I'll take 200, Raven decided, hoping she would find Marcy before she had gone through too much of her hard-earned savings. That night, she packed her knapsack with clothes and toiletry articles. She lay in bed trying to picture her life in the city. Marcy had talked about it with stars in her eyes. Parties, clubs, shopping, movies, all the things they didn't have in their small fishing village. She had wanted independence and a chance to be on her own in a new place. But what price had she paid for freedom? Raven closed her eyes and tried not to imagine the worst. She'd just have to wait and see. The next morning, Raven and her father took their fishing boat to the ferry terminal at Earl's Cove. They tied up at the small dock and walked up the road to flag down the bus when it drove off the ferry from Sultry Bay. A few minutes later, the bus pulled over onto the gravel. Raven hugged her father before boarding and bought a ticket to Vancouver from the driver, who punched it and waved her down the aisle to find a vacant seat. The bus made several stops en route, including the Seashell bus terminal, where she got off to stretch her legs. Next stop was Gibson's, then the Langdale ferry terminal. The ferry was just pulling into sight. Even though she had relatives in Vancouver, she had only been to the city when she was very small and could barely remember it now. Her parents had wanted her to be brought up according to their traditions and thought that the city, schools, and neighborhoods would distract her from the values they believed were important. She hadn't envied what other kids had at the time, but she had been curious. Now, under the worst circumstances, she was going to find out what she had been missing. Despite her nervousness about what lay ahead, the steady hum of the tires almost lulled her to sleep. No wonder Marcy loved the city, Raven thought to herself, looking out the window at the bright city lights spread out like a canvas of twinkling diamonds against the night sky. As the bus continued across the Lionsgate Bridge, through Stanley Park and along the Georgia Street, passengers got on and off, so familiar with the route they read newspapers and books rather than watched the traffic. Raven sat up straight, anxious to arrive. The bus crossed the Georgia Viaduct and headed east into a part of the city with boarded-up buildings, hotels, and bars. The Cobalt Hotel had more than 30 motorcycles parked in formation. Across the street, next to the American Hotel, 2 telephone receivers dangled uselessly from the cables, their wires ripped out. The bus continued up Main Street, then turned left, and left again into the Vancouver bus depot. It was 10 p.m. The depot was deserted except for a few passengers getting off the bus. Where was Rita? Perhaps she was inside, waiting. Raven walked inside and searched the lobby. She was nowhere to be seen. What now? She searched her backpack for her cousin's phone number, dialed and waited. It rang and rang. She would give Rita another hour before trying to find her place on her own. She sat down on a wooden bench facing the large clock in the middle of the depot. Every time somebody walked through the door, she looked up expectantly. She waited until 11 p.m. and then tried the phone number again. Nothing. Raven walked back outside to the bus, where the driver was still sorting freight. She decided to get directions and take the chance that Rita would be there to let her in. She must have written down the arrival time incorrectly. "Can I help you, miss?" the driver inquired. "Yes, thanks. I need directions to my cousin's place," Raven responded. The bus driver looked at the address on the paper Raven showed him and frowned. "Anyone meeting you?" he hedged. "My cousin was supposed to, but she's not here, so I thought I'd walk," she replied. "Well, you'd better be careful. That's a bad area," the driver warned. Go through this building, then straight out the main doors, through the park. Make sure you stay in the middle of the path. Don't stop or talk to anyone. On the far side of the park is Main Street. When you reach it, turn right. The hotel's a couple blocks down the street," he said. "Thank you. I'll find it," Raven answered, a little unsure of her bearings, but determined nonetheless. Raven walked through the building, still searching for her cousin's familiar face. Out on the main out the main automatic doors to where yellow taxicabs waited idly for fares, and finally along the path, keeping her eyes focused straight ahead until she spotted Main Street. Just before she reached the curb, the sound of a deep cough emerged from the shadows, startling her. She sprinted toward the lights and the traffic, not bothering to look back. Over her shoulder, she heard someone's hoarse voice baiting her. "Hey, kid! Why don't you come here and have a drink?" "Yeah, come over and have a snort," jeered another. She ignored them and felt inside her jacket pocket for the paper with her cousin's address printed on it. If only she were there already.